In a quiet Virginian peninsula, untrained farmers and fishermen tightened a noose around Britain's finest army until the hunters became the hunted. The siege of Yorktown September-October 1781 marked the culmination of America's Revolutionary War strategy. It was not simply a triumph of numbers or luck. It was the product of disciplined patience, innovative siegecraft, and the determination of ordinary men who learned to fight like professionals. This moment exposed the vulnerabilities of the mighty British Empire when confronted by a people defending their soil. Below, we break down 6 key aspects of how American colonial farmers, allied with France, successfully besieged and humbled Britain's elite forces at Yorktown. Before we get started, if you're passionate about the real stories behind America's founding, the moments that textbooks skip over, and the decisions that shaped our liberty, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. When the American Revolution began in 1775, the men who rallied to the cause were not soldiers. They were farmers, blacksmiths, millers, fishermen, ordinary men accustomed to wielding tools, not bayonets. Their initial approach to fighting reflected this background: irregular, improvised, and fiercely local. They excelled at ambushes and skirmishes in forests and fields, fighting on familiar ground against the rigid formations of British regulars. But when it came to the formal science of war, especially siege warfare, they were at first entirely unprepared. By the autumn of 1781, however, everything had changed. At Yorktown, these same farmers turned soldiers executed a textbook siege against one of Britain's most elite armies. This transformation was neither accidental nor easy. It was the product of hard lessons, bitter defeats, and the slow acquisition of European military knowledge. In the early years of the war, the Americans learned the hard way what they didn't know. At the Siege of Quebec, 1775-1776, American forces failed to take the city, largely because they lacked proper artillery, engineering skills, and discipline for a prolonged siege in winter. Likewise, at the defense of Fort Washington, 1776, and in other encounters, they suffered when British forces applied heavy guns and fortifications with precision. The Americans were spirited and courageous, but their tactics were insufficient for the realities of 18th century siege warfare. Washington understood that to win, the Continental Army could not rely forever on militia-style hit-and-run tactics. The British could always withdraw into forts and wait them out. To win a decisive victory, the Americans would have to besiege and break British positions the way European armies did, methodically, scientifically, and without giving the enemy an opening to escape. So the Americans began to train, study, and learn. European engineers and officers were crucial to this transformation. One of the most important figures was the Polish engineer Tadeusz Kosciuszko, who joined the American cause in 1776 and taught the Americans how to build fortifications and counter siege works. Likewise, Baron von Steuben, the Prussian drill master, imposed discipline and European techniques on Washington's army during the winter at Valley Forge, 1777-1778. By 1781, these lessons had been absorbed by the rank and file. Many of the men who marched to Yorktown had already spent years building trenches, gun batteries, and fortifications in New York, New Jersey, and the South. They had learned how to work in shifts, dig in silence under fire, and maintain discipline even during the monotony and terror of siege operations. At Yorktown, the Americans also benefited from direct French guidance. The Comte de Rochambeau, commanding French land forces, brought with him experienced engineers who had studied under the greatest masters of Bombard-style siege warfare. They planned the placement of parallels, the zigzag trenches that allowed troops to advance under cover, constructed redoubts to protect artillery, and ensured that each phase of the siege followed sound engineering principles. The American farmers, accustomed to digging furrows and building fences, adapted remarkably well to digging trenches and erecting palisades. The skills they already possessed from their peacetime lives, hard labor, familiarity with tools, endurance, proved indispensable in siege conditions. During the Yorktown siege, these men demonstrated a level of professionalism and discipline that few would have predicted in 1775. They worked through nights under enemy cannon fire, steadily extending their lines closer and closer to the British defenses. Every trench they dug and every mound of earth they heaped up brought them nearer to Cornwallis's fortifications and increased the pressure on the British. What had begun as an army of amateurs had become, in effect, a capable siege force. At Yorktown, American and French forces opened the first parallel on October 6, 1781, about 600 yards from the British defenses. Within days, they completed a second parallel even closer, after capturing 2 key British redoubts in a daring night assault. The Americans maintained the discipline to keep advancing under heavy fire, showing how far they had come. This transformation from Plowshares to Pickets was more than just tactical. It symbolized the Americans' ability to adapt and rise to the demands of modern warfare. They did not rely solely on spirit or sheer numbers. They learned the enemy's methods and used them effectively. Yorktown was as much a victory of education and discipline as of courage and numbers. At Yorktown, the American and French forces achieved what every commander dreams of. They trapped their enemy in a cage with no escape. Cornwallis and his British forces were surrounded on land, blocked by sea, and cut off from supplies and reinforcements. This was not luck. It was the result of deliberate planning, careful maneuvering, and an unprecedented cooperation between colonial farmers, trained continental troops, and their French allies. The encirclement and blockade at Yorktown illustrate how the Americans, once dismissed as a rabble of untrained militiamen, developed the strategic vision and operational discipline to isolate and suffocate an elite British army. Yorktown was a tempting trap because of its geography. The town sits on a narrow peninsula between the York River and the James River, opening into the Chesapeake Bay. Cornwallis had chosen this position believing it would allow easy access to British naval support, secure communications, and a defensible line against American advances. But what seemed like a strength became his undoing. Once the American and French armies began to close in from the north and west, and the French fleet blocked the mouth of the Chesapeake, Cornwallis found himself with water at his back and enemies in front of him, a textbook encirclement. The American forces under George Washington and the French forces under the Comte de Rothschild undertook a remarkable forced march from New York to Virginia, over 400 miles in 6 weeks, to bring their armies into position around Yorktown. The speed and secrecy of this maneuver took the British by surprise. By the end of September 1781, Washington and Rothschild had deployed approximately 17,000 troops against Cornwallis's 8,000. On land, the Americans and French constructed a semicircular ring of fortifications and trenches around the British positions. To the northwest, the French held the left flank, blocking escape toward Williamsburg and Richmond. To the northeast, American forces sealed the line. Together, they built siege lines that pressed closer and closer to the British fortifications. For the colonial farmers, turned soldiers, this phase of the siege called on all their heart and discipline. Day and night they dug earthworks, erected artillery batteries, and laid out the entrenchments that strangled Cornwallis's ability to maneuver. Every avenue of retreat or attack was systematically blocked. What truly sealed Cornwallis's fate was the French Navy's control of the sea. In previous campaigns, the British had always relied on their powerful navy to rescue their armies if they became endangered. Cornwallis fully expected that British ships would arrive to extract his force or bring reinforcements. But this time, the French fleet arrived first. Under Admiral Francois-Joseph Paul de Grasse, a powerful French squadron sailed into the Chesapeake Bay in late August 1781, landing additional troops at Jamestown before anchoring at the mouth of the York River. When a British relief fleet attempted to reach Cornwallis, the French defeated them at the Battle of the Chesapeake, also called the Battle of the Capes, on September 5. This naval victory was decisive. The British fleet was forced to withdraw to New York for repairs, leaving Cornwallis completely cut off by water. This blockade meant no supplies, no reinforcements, and no evacuation. It also prevented British ships from bombarding American and French positions, removing the greatest advantage the British usually enjoyed in North America. The encirclement and blockade had a profound psychological effect on both sides. The besiegers' morale soared as they watched the trap tighten. For the British, every passing day brought growing desperation. Trapped between hostile lines and an impenetrable blockade, with food and ammunition running low, British soldiers and officers alike began to grasp the hopelessness of their position. Cornwallis attempted to evacuate part of his army across the river to Gloucester Point in a desperate night crossing, hoping to break through American lines. But a sudden storm wrecked his boats, ending even that faint hope of escape. By mid-October, the British were completely hemmed in. Their defensive works were collapsing under bombardment, their soldiers exhausted and ill, and no relief fleet in sight. On October 17, 1781, Cornwallis requested a ceasefire to discuss terms of surrender. This dramatic encirclement, a noose tightened by farmers and sailors, was not just a tactical success. It was symbolic of the Americans' growing ability to fight Britain at its own game. Encircling and blockading an elite imperial army was something that would have seemed impossible at the outset of the war. By Yorktown, it was achieved with precision. At Yorktown, the Americans and their French allies demonstrated a mastery of siege warfare, a highly technical and methodical art of war that few thought colonial farmers could ever execute. Rather than relying on a single desperate assault or irregular skirmishing, the besiegers applied centuries-old European siege techniques with patience and precision. They dug trenches, built redoubts, advanced artillery, and systematically dismantled the British defenses. This was not simply a matter of brute force, but of engineering skill, discipline under fire, and coordinated teamwork, all qualities the Americans had developed painfully over the course of 6 long years of war. Siege warfare in the 18th century was a science as much as a battle. The goal was to capture a fortified position with minimal casualties to the attacking force, and without giving the defenders a chance to escape or regroup. Rather than charging headlong into fortifications, besieging armies worked their way closer in stages, using trenches or parallels, and earthworks to protect themselves as they moved artillery into position. The great French military engineer Sébastien Leprestre de Vauban had perfected this method in the previous century, and his principles were applied meticulously at Yorktown. On the night of October 6, 1781, under cover of darkness, American and French soldiers began digging the first parallel, a long trench approximately 600 yards from the British defenses. This distance placed them just outside effective musket range, but close enough for artillery to begin harassing fire. The digging was carried out silently to avoid alerting the British. Farmers and craftsmen who once dug furrows and built fences now dug military trenches and raised earthworks. They worked in shifts through the night, carving out the zigzagging sap's narrow trenches that connected the parallel to the rear to allow movement of men and supplies without exposing them to enemy fire. Once the first parallel was established, the besiegers opened a heavy bombardment. American and French artillery crews fired thousands of rounds over the course of the siege, pounding British earthworks, gun positions, and even the town itself. The bombardment served several purposes. It destroyed British artillery emplacements and weakened fortifications. It disrupted attempts at repair and demoralized the defenders. It kept the British pinned down in their trenches, unable to mount effective counterattacks. This relentless hammering made life inside the British lines almost unbearable. One British officer wrote that the whole peninsula trembled under the incessant thunder of the enemy's guns. After several days of bombardment and with the British defenses weakened, the Americans and French began work on a second parallel, even closer to the British lines, approximately 300 yards away. However, to secure this closer line, they needed to neutralize two British forward positions, Redoubts 9 and 10, which dominated the terrain between the first parallel and the British inner defenses. On the night of October 14, 1781, in one of the most dramatic actions of the siege, the Americans under Alexander Hamilton stormed Redoubt 10 with fixed bayonets, while French forces captured Redoubt 9. These assaults cleared the way for the second parallel to be completed. Once the second parallel was established, the attackers moved even heavier artillery forward, concentrating their fire on the now exposed heart of the British defenses. At this point, Cornwallis's position was essentially indefensible. The step-by-step advance was crucial because it minimized casualties for the attackers while exhausting the defenders. Every trench dug brought the attackers closer. Every cannon moved forward increased the intensity of bombardment, and every night the defenders grew weaker, both physically and psychologically. For the Americans, who at the start of the war had no experience with formal siegecraft, this operation was a stunning display of their transformation. The farmers who once fought guerrilla skirmishes now moved artillery batteries forward like professionals, dug parallels with precision, and coordinated their movements under constant fire. The science of the siege also symbolized a kind of quiet inevitability. The Americans and French did not overwhelm Cornwallis in a single dramatic clash. They ground him down with calculation and patience, showing that discipline and engineering could defeat even the world's best trained army. The siege works advanced, the guns roared, and the British position crumbled, day by day, inch by inch. This was not only a military victory, but also a demonstration that the Americans had learned to fight by the rules of the very empire they opposed, and to use those rules against it. By the autumn of 1781, the British Army under General Charles Cornwallis at Yorktown found itself not just surrounded, but slowly undone from within. Siege warfare is as much about endurance as about combat, and in this respect the British were at a severe disadvantage. The encirclement by American and French forces, the relentless bombardment, and the complete naval blockade combined to make daily life in the British camp a grim ordeal. Disease spread unchecked, food and water supplies dwindled, and the psychological strain of encirclement eroded the fighting spirit of even the most disciplined troops. The hardships endured by Cornwallis's elite forces at Yorktown illustrate how war, especially siege warfare, punishes defenders as much through deprivation and despair as through direct violence. At the start of the siege, Cornwallis commanded approximately 8,000 troops, including British regulars, Hessian mercenaries, loyalist auxiliaries, and camp followers. Yorktown itself was a small tobacco port, not remotely equipped to feed or shelter such a force under siege conditions. As soon as the French fleet blockaded the Chesapeake and the Americans completed their land encirclement, Cornwallis's supply lines were cut. No fresh food, no medical supplies, and no reinforcements could reach the town. The garrison had to rely on what little was stored locally, which quickly proved insufficient. Rations were reduced to bare minimums. Soldiers subsisted on salted meat and hardtack, with little in the way of fresh produce. This led to widespread malnutrition and scurvy. Water, too, became scarce and contaminated, as the few wells in Yorktown could not sustain the needs of thousands of men. Soldiers drank from muddy streams and makeshift cisterns, which spread disease. Starvation loomed, and by mid-October many men were weakened and unable to carry out basic duties. In Cornwallis's own words, written during the siege, "We have not above 3 days' provisions in store, and our situation is truly critical." As the siege wore on, disease became as deadly as enemy cannonballs. In cramped and unsanitary conditions, with thousands of men and animals packed into a small area under constant bombardment, diseases like dysentery, typhus, and malaria spread rapidly. Wounded soldiers often lay untreated in makeshift hospitals where infections festered. Flies and vermin infested food supplies and living quarters alike, and latrines overflowed. The sick and dying crowded tents and trenches, further lowering morale. In siege warfare, the mental toll on the defenders can be devastating. Cut off from the outside world, subject to constant bombardment, and unable to strike back effectively, Cornwallis's troops endured weeks of psychological torment. The Americans and French bombarded the town day and night, their heavy guns roaring in an unceasing rhythm that shook the ground and set buildings aflame. Sleep was scarce, nerves frayed, and tempers flared. Witnessing one's own defenses being methodically destroyed, without the ability to halt the attackers or receive aid, wears down even hardened soldiers. The failed British sortie on October 16, a desperate nighttime attempt to spike American guns and break the siege lines, was repelled with heavy losses. The failure of this attack dashed any remaining hope that a breakout was possible. Adding to the despair was the realization that no relief fleet was coming. Cornwallis had counted on the Royal Navy to arrive from New York and rescue his army, but after the French naval victory at the Battle of the Chesapeake, it became clear that rescue was impossible. The defenders now faced the bitter truth: they were completely alone. Cornwallis himself felt the weight of these hardships acutely. Confined to his headquarters due to illness and mental strain, he delegated command on the day of surrender to his second in command, Brigadier General Charles O'Hara. Even Cornwallis, a respected and seasoned general, could not bear the humiliation of personally handing over his sword in defeat. Letters he wrote during the siege reveal a commander increasingly resigned to the inevitable. His once confident tone gave way to expressions of desperation, referring to his army as being in want of everything, and his situation as untenable. By mid-October, the combination of hunger, sickness, and demoralization rendered the British garrison incapable of meaningful resistance. Soldiers were too weak to mount counterattacks, and the constant bombardment left them huddling in ruins. The proud army that had once overrun New York, Philadelphia, and Charleston now found itself humiliated and broken on the banks of the York River. On October 17, a white flag appeared above the British lines, a signal of surrender. For Cornwallis's army, the hardships of the siege had become too much to bear. By mid-October 1781, the Americans and French had methodically advanced their siege works at Yorktown to within striking distance of the British inner defenses. But to fully encircle and destroy the British position, they faced one final obstacle: two outer defensive positions known as Redoubt No. 9 and Redoubt No. 10. These redoubts, small enclosed earthen fortifications, were positioned in front of Cornwallis's main line. Armed with artillery and defended by determined British troops, they dominated the ground between the first and second parallels of the besiegers. Unless these strong points were captured, the Allied siege lines could advance no further without taking devastating fire. Their seizure became the decisive moment of the Yorktown siege. In siege warfare, control of advanced positions is essential. The Americans and French had already dug a second parallel trench line closer to the British defenses, but this line was vulnerable to fire from redoubts 9 and 10. If the Allies could capture these redoubts, they would gain two crucial advantages: a safe path to extend their trenches even closer to the British main line, elevated positions from which to mount heavy artillery against the heart of the British defenses. Without neutralizing these positions, the final phase of the siege would be delayed and potentially far bloodier. On October 14, 1781, General Washington ordered a coordinated night assault on both redoubts. The French were assigned Redoubt 9 on the left, while the Americans were tasked with taking Redoubt 10 on the right. Both attacks would rely on stealth, speed, and the element of surprise. To minimize noise and prevent the defenders from being alerted too soon, the soldiers were ordered to fix bayonets and unload their muskets. This would be a silent, brutal fight in the dark. For the Americans, the assault on Redoubt 10 became a moment of glory, led by a young, ambitious Lieutenant Colonel, Alexander Hamilton. Though not yet the iconic figure of later fame, Hamilton had already proven his skill and courage as an aide. He camped to Washington and now sought the chance to lead men in battle. Just after dusk, under cover of artillery fire from Allied lines, Hamilton's assault party of about 400 men advanced silently toward Redoubt 10. French artillery had battered the redoubt earlier in the day, weakening its walls but failing to destroy it. The Americans reached the ditch at the base of the redoubt and, without firing a shot, began to climb its earthen walls under intense British musket and cannon fire. Using ladders, bayonets, and sheer determination, they surged over the parapet into the redoubt. Inside, the fighting was fierce and chaotic. In close quarters, bayonets and the butts of muskets did the grim work as smoke and shouts filled the air. Despite the ferocity of British resistance, the Americans overwhelmed the defenders in about 10 minutes. According to accounts, the Americans killed or captured nearly all the British troops in the redoubt, with relatively light casualties, around 9 killed and 25 wounded. Hamilton himself displayed remarkable bravery, personally leading the charge and ordering his men to spare as many prisoners as possible, despite the heat of battle. Meanwhile, on the left, French forces attacked Redoubt 9 with equal determination. Their advance was slowed by heavier resistance and stronger fortifications, and they suffered higher casualties, around 100, but eventually succeeded in capturing the position. French engineers quickly began connecting Redoubt 9 to the Allied siege lines. With both redoubts in Allied hands, the Americans and French wasted no time. Overnight, they extended their trenches and brought up more artillery to the newly captured positions. By morning, heavy guns in the redoubts were already bombarding the British inner line at point-blank range. Cornwallis's situation, already dire, became hopeless. His defenses were now fully exposed, his troops demoralized, and his supplies nearly exhausted. The capture of the redoubts effectively sealed his fate. 3 days later, he asked for terms of surrender. The storming of redoubts 9 and 10 was not just tactically decisive. It was symbolically powerful. For the Americans, it was proof of how far their army had come since the early days of the war. The farmers and tradesmen who had once scattered before British bayonets at Bunker Hill and Brooklyn Heights now launched a disciplined, professional assault and won. It also demonstrated the strength of the Franco-American alliance, with both nations working together to tighten the noose on Britain's best. For the British, it was the moment they realized their position was beyond saving. The outer defenses had fallen, the inner works were crumbling, and there was no hope of relief. The siege of Yorktown was not just a brilliant American and French operation. It was also the culmination of British overreach, strategic missteps, and global pressures that left Cornwallis isolated and vulnerable. To understand how a force of colonial farmers and artisans, backed by French allies, could trap and defeat one of Britain's finest armies, we must place Yorktown in its broader context. A world war stretching Britain to its limits, and an American population determined to exploit every imperial weakness. In 1775, when rebellion first flared in Massachusetts, Britain still looked like an invincible global power. Its navy ruled the seas, its armies had conquered colonies on 5 continents, and it boasted vast resources. Yet this vastness was a double-edged sword. By 1781, Britain was fighting not just American rebels, but also France, Spain, and the Dutch Republic, all of whom had entered the war to weaken Britain's empire. The American Revolution became part of a wider conflict historians now call the American Revolutionary War, within the Anglo-French Global War. British forces were fighting in the Caribbean to protect their sugar islands, in India against French and Indian forces, and in Europe to counter French and Spanish maneuvers. Every theater demanded ships, soldiers, and money. The British also made serious strategic errors that led to the disaster at Yorktown. Initially, British commanders underestimated both the determination of the Americans and the ability of Washington to coordinate with his French allies. In early 1781, British command decided to shift operations to the south, believing that there were more loyalists there who would rally to their cause. Cornwallis marched through the Carolinas and into Virginia, expecting to find supplies, loyalist support, and an easier campaign. Instead, he met fierce resistance from militia forces and continental troops who employed scorch, turf tactics, and harassment, making his campaign costly and exhausting. Cornwallis believed that Yorktown, situated on the coast, would provide a secure position where he could be resupplied or evacuated by sea. But this assumption was based on Britain maintaining absolute naval superiority, an advantage they lost when the French fleet arrived first. The Americans, by contrast, learned how to exploit Britain's overextension. Washington, always attuned to both political and military realities, kept his army intact even after repeated defeats, refusing to risk it in open battle unless the odds were favorable. When word came that Admiral de Grasse was sailing to the Chesapeake with a powerful fleet, Washington immediately recognized the opportunity. He and Rochambeau deceived the British into thinking they planned to attack New York, then marched their armies south at lightning speed to trap Cornwallis before Britain could react. The Franco-American plan at Yorktown was bold but also perfectly timed. It succeeded because Britain was stretched thin, its navy temporarily outmatched in American waters, and its army stuck in a hostile territory without the promised loyalist support. By 1781, the war had also become deeply unpopular in Britain itself. Parliament was weary of pouring money and men into a war that seemed increasingly unwinnable. The defeat at Yorktown came as the final blow to British public confidence in the war. When news of Cornwallis's surrender reached London in late November, Lord North, the British Prime Minister, reportedly exclaimed, "Oh God, it is all over." The political cost of continuing the war outweighed any possible gain. Yorktown exposed how vulnerable Britain had become, not just on the battlefield, but also economically and politically. In the end, the British at Yorktown were not defeated by sheer force of arms alone. They were defeated because the Americans and French exploited the weaknesses inherent in a sprawling empire fighting on too many fronts. Cornwallis's army, though elite and disciplined, was only one small piece of Britain's global war machine. Once cut off from the rest of that machine, trapped on a peninsula with no hope of rescue, it became just another garrison left to its fate. The broader context of Yorktown reminds us that even the strongest empires can falter when they fail to adapt to changing conditions. The Americans succeeded not merely because they fought bravely, but because they understood the limits of Britain's power and turned those limits to their advantage. Ordinary colonial farmers, fighting alongside French soldiers and sailors, demonstrated that a smaller, more nimble force, backed by sound strategy and alliances, could defeat even the mightiest empire on earth. The siege of Yorktown was more than the surrender of an army. It was the triumph of persistence, adaptation, and cooperation between unlikely allies. Ordinary colonial farmers and craftsmen, under visionary leadership, applied the patient science of siege warfare to bring an empire to its knees. What they achieved on that Virginian peninsula was not just a military victory, but a defining moment of self-determination. The hunted became the hunters, and history turned in their favor. What do you think? Did I miss any major myths? Are there other aspects of this alternate history scenario you'd like me to explore? Let me know in the comments, and as always, don't forget to like and subscribe for more historical myth busting.